You finally have a free afternoon. No meetings, no obligations, nothing urgent that needs doing. So you sit down with a book, or turn on a show, or just lie there. And within 10 minutes, there's this feeling. Not quite anxiety, not quite shame, but somewhere in between. A sense that you should be doing something. That rest is only acceptable once you've earned it. That stopping feels irresponsible. And here's the strange part. The guilt doesn't come from actual laziness. It comes from doing exactly what rest is supposed to be, nothing. You could have worked all week, managed a household, helped 3 people solve their problems, and still, the moment you stop, your nervous system starts sending signals that something is wrong. Like you've forgotten a responsibility. Like rest itself is the problem. Most people assume this is about work ethic or self-discipline. That if you feel guilty for resting, you just need to give yourself permission. But here's what most people don't realize. This isn't a motivation issue. It's a conditioning issue. The guilt isn't coming from laziness. It's coming from years of learning that your value is tied to your output. That being needed is safer than being still. And that rest, for you, has never been neutral. This didn't start in adulthood. Psychologists have found that women who feel guilty for resting often grew up in environments where their role was to manage other people's comfort, not necessarily in dramatic ways. Sometimes it was subtle. Being the one who noticed when someone was upset, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made sure everyone else was okay before attending to themselves. And when that becomes your job as a child, your nervous system learns something specific, that your safety comes from being useful. Neuroscience shows that the brain is constantly scanning for threat, and for many women, emotional neglect or relational instability in childhood creates a specific threat response, not to danger, but to stillness. Because if your value is conditional on what you provided, then stopping feels like losing your place. Rest becomes coded as risk. And even decades later, when you sit down to do nothing, your body doesn't register it as relaxation. It registers it as exposure. This is where the guilt actually comes from. It's not moral, it's neurological. The part of your brain that governs survival learned early on that productivity equals safety. That being still means being overlooked. And so rest doesn't feel like recovery. It feels like abandonment of duty. Your nervous system, trying to protect you, interprets downtime as a threat to your worth. And this doesn't just affect how you rest. It shapes how you relate to people. Women with this pattern often become the ones others turn to. The friend who always has time, the colleague who picks up slack, the partner who anticipates needs before they're spoken, and there's real skill in that. The ability to read a room, to know what's needed, to step in before things fall apart. That's not weakness. That's emotional intelligence built from necessity. But here's the part that's rarely talked about. When care becomes your identity, rest becomes a betrayal of it. Because if you've spent your life being the person who makes things easier for others, then doing something just for yourself feels selfish. Not because it is, but because your sense of self has been built around being needed. And when you're not actively helping, there's this quiet fear that you're not enough. Research in attachment psychology shows that people who grew up as caretakers often develop what's called hyperresponsibility. It's the internalized belief that everything is your job. That if something goes wrong and you didn't prevent it, you failed. And this doesn't show up as dramatic self-blame. It shows up in small, constant ways. The inability to delegate, the discomfort with being cared for, the feeling that rest is only okay once everyone else is settled. And the tricky thing is, this pattern often gets rewarded. People appreciate someone who's always available, who doesn't complain, who gets things done, and so you keep doing it because it works. Because being useful feels safer than being vulnerable. But what most people don't see is the cost, the chronic low-level tension, the inability to fully relax, the sense that you're only valuable when you're contributing. This is what creates the guilt, not moral failure, not lack of discipline, but a nervous system that equates rest with risk. And the guilt isn't punishing you for being lazy. It's trying to push you back into the role that feels safe, the role where you're needed and therefore secure. So when does this pattern become a problem? Because the truth is, not all caretaking is damaging. Some people genuinely find meaning in helping others. The difference comes down to one question. Does this energize you, or does it erase you? If taking care of people feels like an extension of who you are, something you choose, not something you owe, then it's probably healthy. But if rest makes you feel guilty, if being still triggers anxiety, If you can't stop without feeling like you're letting someone down, then the pattern isn't about care anymore. It's about survival. And survival-based caregiving doesn't restore you. It depletes you. Here's another way to tell the difference. After you rest, do you feel restored? Or do you feel like you've done something wrong? Do you let yourself stop when you're tired, or only when everything else is finished? And when someone offers to help you, can you accept it without feeling like you've failed? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're diagnostic ones. Because women who feel guilty for resting often don't realize how deep the pattern goes until they try to break it. And what they find is that it's not just about rest. It's about permission. Permission to exist without being useful. Permission to take up space without earning it. Permission to stop, not because everything's done, but because they're tired. Neuroscience research on burnout shows that chronic activation of the stress response, constantly being on, constantly managing, constantly anticipating, eventually wears down the system. And rest, real rest, is what allows the nervous system to reset. But if rest triggers guilt, the system never fully recovers. You're stuck in a loop where the thing you need most feels like the thing you're least allowed to have. And this is where awareness becomes important, not as a fix, not as a step-by-step solution, but as a way of understanding what's actually happening. The guilt you feel when you rest isn't a character flaw. It's a signal that your nervous system is still operating from old rules. Rules that said your worth was conditional. That being still was dangerous. That care was your currency. Awareness doesn't erase the guilt, but it changes what the guilt means. Instead of proof that you're selfish, it becomes evidence of a pattern that made sense once, a pattern that kept you safe in an environment where being needed was the only reliable source of value. And recognizing that, really seeing it, gives you a choice. Not to force yourself to rest, not to override the guilt with logic, but to notice it, to understand where it came from, and to slowly, carefully, teach your nervous system that rest is not abandonment. This takes time. Because you're not just changing a habit, you're renegotiating a survival strategy. And survival strategies don't let go easily. But the more you understand what's driving the guilt, the less power it has, the less it feels like truth, and the more it feels like an old message that no longer applies. So if this resonates, the question isn't how to stop feeling guilty. The question is, what happens when you start recognizing the guilt for what it is? Not a warning, not a moral compass, but a reflex. One you can notice, understand, and eventually choose whether to follow. If this video resonated with you, the next one explores why some women need constant reassurance to feel loved, and what that pattern is really asking for.